I am here today to talk to you about some of the books that changed my life. So the first book I want to share with you is from the late Professor Derek Bell, a brilliant legal mind who wrote a fiction-based series, and this is one of those books. It's Faces at the Bottom of the Well. The Permanence of Racism is the subtitle, and this is a book that I first read in law school. It's a New York Times bestseller, and I want to just read a passage from this book to you all. When a Black person or group makes a statement or takes an action that the white community or vocal components thereof deem outrageous, the latter will actively recruit Blacks willing to refute the statement or condemn the action. We've seen them just the other day. Blacks who respond to the call for condemnation will receive superstanding status. Those Blacks who refuse to be recruited will be interpreted as endorsing the statements in action and may suffer political or economic reprisals. Here's the thing. I started by saying this was a fiction-based series, and the reality of it is, this is real life. Like, we see this stuff every day, and I think it's so important for folks to understand that fiction doesn't mean that it doesn't have any association with the truth. It just means that it is based on a not true story. So the lead character in this book is Geneva Crenshaw. In the series is Geneva Crenshaw. And I think it's so important for us to be familiar with this. The other little tidbit I'm gonna offer here is I read this book in a law school class related to critical race theory, something that is regularly touted these days out of context. And critical race theory is the understanding of race as it is associated with the law, how race has shifted over time. And Derek Bell is was a brilliant critical race theory legal professor and brilliant legal mind, as I said. And speaking of Black history, and again, nowadays it's just called critical race theory. That's not a thing in real life. Before the Mayflower is a book by Lerone Bennett Jr. This book used to be in the back of every Ebony magazine. It was always advertised back there, and he was a brilliant historian. A history of the Negro in America, 1619 to 1964. And one of my favorite passages in this book that really takes us from before we arrived to this continent to where we are now, although this version of this book is from the 60s, I believe. Let me check. This book was my mom's. So let's see. This was published 1961. And it was by Johnson Publishing Company, which is why I was in every Ebony magazine. So what I love about this book is it really teaches us history that we did not learn in textbooks. And to this day, kids definitely are not learning this. And let me give an example. Most scholars deny that the Egyptians were Negroes, despite the testimony of an eyewitness. I don't know how to say this. Herodotus is what I'm going to say. The Greek historian visited the country some 500 years before Bethlehem. The Egyptians, he said, were black and curly-haired. Group identity aside, it is clear from the record that a large proportion of the ancient Egyptians, at least 1/3, were undoubted Negroes. Many, perhaps most, of the soldiers were Negroes. Black peoples toiled on the pyramids, offered prayers to the sun god, and served with distinction in the state bureaucracy. Ancient Egypt knew him, the Negro. Alexander Chamberlain said, both bond and free, and his blood flowed in the veins of not a few of the mighty pharaohs. So that tells us a little bit about our history before the Mayflower. And what I think is super significant about this, people won't like to hear it, but it's the truth. He starts, even in the 1960s, our history, 1619 for Americas. Turns out America didn't just start 1776 with the Revolutionary War. Turns out it started a little before that at our arrival. And speaking of the 1619 project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the brilliant professor now at Howard University, UNC slept on her and shouldn't have, published 2 pieces with the New York Times Magazine. Some of you may have seen the brilliant feature for the anniversary of our arrival of 1619 and 2019. Award-winning New York Times Magazine curation by Nicole Hannah-Jones. She has an adult version of our story and a children's version of our story. And because there hasn't been a lot of conversation on the children version of our story. I want to read an excerpt from there. Make sure you get both of these. There are kids all over this country and other places throughout the world who need to be familiar with our history, understand we didn't originate in the belly of a slave ship, but also need to understand our, really treacherous history in this country from the outset. So this is the 1619 project, Born on the Water. And this is the passage I want to read. It's called Stolen. Also, the illustrations in this book are amazing. So stolen is the passage. And the white people took them anyway, kidnapped them, baptized them in the name of their God, stamped them with new names. Ours is no immigration story. They did not get to pack bags stuffed with cherished things, with the doll grandmama had woven from tall grass, with the baby blanket handed down from generation to generation all the way back, so far back that it carried the scent of the ancestors. They could not hug their fathers and mothers, daughters and sons, hearts thumping in rhythm, clinging to that final sweetness before the parting. No promises whispered from mouth to ear of seeing each other soon. And so it's sad. I think normally when we think about children's books, we think about stories that bring us joy or happy, and sometimes we have to share stories with children that may not be all joyful, but this is our real history, and so this is brilliant work. Make sure you get a copy of the 1619 Project. The next is a memoir. This is an autobiography written by Angela Davis, who I was named after. She's so dope. I want to bring this to the forefront because her life changed mine. My dad named me after Angela Davis. Angela means bringer of truth or messenger of God. And I think this book is really important because it's not talked about often. Her story is so powerful. And so one of the things I want to read about here, because it relates to today, and some of the things that I'm reading, it's frustrating to see that it still correlates with things we're experiencing now. But this is based on a passage in the book where she's talking about a people's tribunal to convict an LAPD officer. And what I think is so powerful about this passage is we don't hold people's tribunals. We expect that there will be justice in a court of law, and that's not always the case. And I think that she illustrates that in this particular passage. So she says, we were demanding justice about which Black people needed to be defiant and passionate. After hundreds of years of suffering the most persistently one-sided bestiality and violence, how could we seriously assume a posture of unbiased observers? The witnesses were called. They gave their testimony of events leading up to and following Gregory's death. This is the man who was killed by the LAPD. Other witnesses were called to give expert testimony on this unchecked racism in the LAPD. Past police murders in the Black community were documented stitch by stitch, and a tapestry of racist horrors was woven. At the center of this tapestry was Gregory Clark, whose killer was arrogantly screaming self-defense. We tried and convicted Carlson not for being the originator and sole perpetrator of the crime, but because he had been an all too willing accomplice in the routine business of a racist system. I read that because there are still so many of our brothers, sisters, siblings who are killed by the police, and we still have to find justice in our own way, and often that is just by teaching our children how to survive another day, because we can't promise them that in an interaction with law enforcement that they'll make it out alive. So that is a somber note, but it is a truthful note. And finally, this is a new book to me, but it has changed my life. Resma Menachem wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. My good friend and brother, Mike De La Rocha, put me onto this. Resma has become a brother now. We are working on some things together. Also a New York Times bestseller. This book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. Such an important body of work. Resma is a licensed social worker, therapist, has appeared on shows like Dr. Phil and Oprah Winfrey, trained the Minneapolis Police Department. Some of those officers should have gone to the training. But I love this book so much. In the passage I want to read, he's talking about his grandmother, who is the through line throughout this book. So he says, "My grandmother was a strong and loving woman, but her body was frequently nervous. She often had a sense that something terrible was about to happen. It was an ancient, inherited sensation that rarely left her, a traumatic retention. She would soothe that sense of impending disaster in a variety of ways. When she was in the kitchen, she would hum. Not a steady tone, but entire melodies. Her humming was never soft and intimate, but loud and firm, as if she were humming for an audience. As a small child, if I knew the song she was humming, sometimes I would hum along with her, and my body would experience safety and settledness. She also frequently comforted herself by rocking, both forward and backward and from side to side. When I would watch her rock, it never looked nervous or neurotic. Instead, it felt like a sacred ritual imbued with meaning and purpose. Sometimes she would hum as she rocked." And I read that because I think if we close our eyes and think about what he described there, we can see our own grandmothers and aunts and mothers. We can see some of that in our own bodies, and that is how Black people have learned to survive our trauma. Resmaa has sections in these books that I think are really important. Resmaa would say that the body practices in this book are the most important pieces. It's not the words on the pages, it's also doing the exercises. And I think whether it's cooking together, which he talks about in this book, humming or rocking, those are the things we do to soothe ourselves and to purge trauma out of our bodies. So it's an excellent piece. From a wellness perspective, really good, helping us to keep our sound minds in such treacherous and turbulent times.